Well, here we are, still online for another important Christian feast. Who would have thought when we rang in 2020 that the year would unfold like this? It feels like we've been on a long journey, like the Magi that we honor today. And like them, we're nearing the end, or at least the sense of one. Matthew starts his story at a 3/4 mark in the narrative, with the Magi arriving in Jerusalem, leaving me to wonder, why did they make the trek in the first place? Why would they go from what was likely Persia all the way to the highlands on the east of the Mediterranean? What import does a new ruler in a tiny little place at the edge of the Roman Empire have for people such as these? Well, not much in the real world. A reminder that Matthew's story of Jesus' birth, like Luke's, is theology, not history, not to be taken literally. And so instead, we're invited to consider the details and to ponder their significance about who is this Jesus and why did he come in the first place? Now, there's the obvious detail, which we hear alluded to in Ephesians. That is, the Magi aren't Jewish. They aren't even from the Roman Empire, outside the expected circle who would care about Jesus' birth. But what strikes me is an extension of this detail, namely how far they have traveled. And I don't just mean physical distance. There is religious, cultural, and socioeconomic distance that they've traveled as well. And there's also emotional distance at play in this narrative. What I mean by this is that disconnect someone feels from another person when they're caught up in their own agenda. If you don't seem like me, well, I don't have any skin in the game to change your circumstances. We see this not in the Magi, but in the reaction of King Herod when the Magi arrive. From a literary view, the Magi are a foil to King Herod. They are outsiders, come from a long distance, wanting to pay homage to a newborn king. Herod isn't an outsider, and while physically close, he is emotionally the opposite. All he sees in Jesus' birth is a threat to his power. His real intention in paying homage, well, it becomes clear when the Magi return to their country by a different route, and he unleashes a slaughter on all the male children 2 years old and under. He's cold. He needs to keep political power, or he'll lose the socioeconomic distance he holds at the expense of his people. Now, these varying distances, they're not just part of the Magi story, they're part of our own context as well. They can operate to ill effect, even perpetuating, enabling injustice. Consider the case of Yemen. The crisis has been unfolding since 2015. A civil war becomes a proxy battle between Iran and Saudi Arabia. 80% of the people are in dire need, including 12 million children, starving, without adequate sanitation in a pandemic. This is a serious circumstance. But the humanitarian crisis has been mostly ignored. Why? Because it's a casualty of distance. Physical distance, they're on the other side of the world. Religious distance, from a Western perspective, they're Muslims. But split almost evenly between Shia and Sunni, they're caught in a Muslim divide as well. Cultural distance. They're geopolitically small. They don't have much influence, and nobody wants to alienate the Saudis and lose our flow of oil. And we can apply these distances, well, closer to home. Consider indigenous communities. Many still have inadequate drinking water, and the most vulnerable tend to be the communities that are the most remote, the most out of sight and out of mind. Equally true is the lack of access to medical care. So inadequate sanitation plus lack of medical care means that when COVID-19 comes to an indigenous community, it spreads rapidly. Racism thrives because people maintain physical distance and so are able to hold on to emotional distance as well. And this past year has exposed how much of this is at play. Consider all of the gaps that were revealed in our social and global fabric. Ongoing failure to keep our residents in care homes safe, even now. Higher risks at work faced by people of color, women, and other outsider groups. Clear double standards when it comes to following healthcare protocols by some. All possible because of distance. Fortunately, this distance can be overcome, as we hear in our Magi story. Yes, they travel from a far-off land, but more to the point, the distance was bridged spiritually. After all, they return home by a different route. In other words, they have been changed in their hearts. The Ephesian reading says much the same, focused on the healing of the divide between Jews and Gentiles. The passage reminds us that any distance we experience, even when someone lives right beside us, will only be overcome with spiritual help. This is something that played over and over again in my mind this week, or more to the point, over and over again in my ear, as the song From a Distance by Bette Midler annoyingly got stuck there. Now, in 1990, I didn't like the song. I thought it was a bit deist. God far away, having set the universe in motion and just watching from a distance. But I've come to appreciate what the song's really about. The world with no more guns or disease or hunger. A world where I see a friend in my enemy, where we're joined together in harmony, is the world as God sees the world. That is God's reign, is God's vision for us. And we come to live into this when we begin to see each other as God sees us. And we get there with grace. Like for the Magi, God helps us overcome the distance. And friends, we're not passive in this. And so as we begin a new year, we can each make a resolution to cultivate a spirit of prayer and contemplation in our lives. If you're not already doing it, find something to do. Take up Bible or other spiritual reading, that is, reading a text with an open heart to where the Spirit is speaking. Perhaps practice journaling, being intentionally open while going for a walk in nature, meditating with music, walking the labyrinth, practicing centering prayer, praying as you paint. There is a long list of spiritual practices. One of the great gifts of Christian spirituality is communion. And so I am so thankful that we continue to celebrate the sacrament virtually, spiritually fed at this and tables across our community. There are so many different types of spiritual practice. If you're unsure of what to do, I'd be happy to help you discern the best one for you. It doesn't matter what you do. The important thing is you take time in prayer. And be aware that it isn't a substitute to responding to the injustices of a world, those that flourish because of distance. It's just the opposite. When I take time in meditation, I find I'm more able to draw on the strength, the wisdom, and the love that I need to respond. And more than that, it breaks down the false divisions that we experience in our lives. I discover deeper connections. This is key, or I risk doing the work of justice from a distance. That is, holding on to the gaps and working out of pity or anger rather than a deep sense of solidarity. Friends, like the Magi, we've been on a journey this year, one that's highlighted myriad gaps in our social and global fabric. But like them, we can bridge the spiritual gap that enables other distances to flourish. The Magi were willing to seek for the child and were changed in the process. We can be changed as well if we offer the gift of our time, hearts open to the spiritual growth that Christ offers. May it be so. Amen.